I had seen her 100 times before, though always from a polite distance. She was my neighbor, the woman across the hall, the one who always seemed to carry herself with a kind of grace that made people stop without realizing why. 40-something, confident in her movements, yet there was always a softness about her, something almost fragile hiding beneath the poise. Most evenings, I'd catch a glimpse of her tending the small row of potted plants on her balcony. She wasn't the kind of woman who needed to do much to draw attention. A simple tuck of hair behind her ear, the way she stood in thoughtful silence, even the tilt of her head when she watered the roses. Everything about her seemed deliberate, meaningful. And I was the 20-something guy next door who couldn't help but notice. Too young, I told myself. Too complicated. She was married, and I was simply the neighbor who exchanged small nods in the hallway. But that night was different. I was walking back to my apartment after a late errand, keys in hand, when I saw her standing at her doorway. The hallway light spilled down over her, catching faint gold strands in her hair, softening the quiet curve of her smile. She didn't move immediately, as if she had been waiting, or maybe hoping, to see someone. Our eyes met, and instead of the usual polite nod, she spoke first. Her voice was calm, but there was something behind it, something I hadn't heard before. "My husband's out till morning." For a second, I wasn't sure I had heard her right. The words hung in the air, balanced between casual and charged. She tilted her head slightly, the corners of her lips curving into a knowing smile, not mischievous but inviting. I could have laughed it off. I could have nodded politely, said good night, and disappeared into my own apartment like I always did. But something in her expression, the openness, the quiet hint of loneliness, made me pause. I took one slow step closer, then another, until I was standing just a few feet from her doorway. The faintest trace of her perfume reached me, warm and floral, a scent that instantly made the hallway feel less empty. Her hand rested lightly against the doorframe, relaxed, yet there was a stillness to her posture as if she were waiting to see what I'd do next. And in that moment, I surprised myself. "Then I'm not leaving," I said softly. The words came out steadier than I expected, but my chest tightened with the weight of them. She didn't flinch, didn't draw back. Instead, her smile deepened, touched with something unspoken, relief, maybe, or gratitude, and she stepped aside, opening the door wider. Her living room glowed with a soft golden light, and as she gestured me inside, I knew something in the air had shifted. This wasn't just a neighborly chat anymore. This was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand, but already couldn't turn away from. Stepping across her threshold felt different than I expected. I'd seen her doorway 100 times, always from the outside, just another door in the hallway. But from the moment I entered, I realized how little I knew of her world. Her living room was softly lit, golden light spilling from a lamp shaded with fabric that gave everything a warm, amber tone. It wasn't a large space, but it felt alive, lived in. A blanket folded neatly over the arm of the couch, a small stack of books resting on a coffee table, family photographs on the wall. They showed her smiling beside her husband at gatherings with relatives at places that looked like summer vacations. Yet in the silence of the room, those pictures felt like distant echoes of a different life, one she wasn't living tonight. She moved gracefully across the room, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. There was nothing rushed in her manner. She carried herself like someone who knew the weight of her presence. Her voice broke the quiet as she gestured toward the couch. "Sit, I'll make us some tea." Her tone was casual, but it carried warmth. Not an offer, more like a gentle insistence. I lowered myself onto the sofa, sinking into the cushion, listening to the faint sounds from the kitchen, the soft clink of porcelain cups, the low hum of the kettle as it heated. The moments stretched, and I let myself take in her space. It wasn't luxurious, but it had touches of her everywhere. The scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, maybe from a candle burned earlier, and the quiet order of the room reflected her nature, composed but tender. When she returned, she carried a small tray with 2 cups of tea, the porcelain trembling just slightly as she set it down. She wasn't nervous, but I sensed something beneath her calmness, as if she was aware this moment meant more than it should. She handed me 1 cup, and as her fingers brushed mine, warmth spread through me that had nothing to do with the tea. I thanked her softly, though my voice felt different in my own ears. Lower, more careful, like words mattered more here. She sat opposite me at first, one leg crossed over the other, her posture elegant yet relaxed. She lifted her cup, blew gently across the surface, and for a moment, her eyes lifted to mine over the rim. It was such a small glance, but it lasted longer than it should have, sending a quiet current through the space between us. I sipped the tea, the taste of chamomile and honey settling on my tongue. But it wasn't the flavor I noticed most. It was the way she tilted slightly toward me, her body angled as though part of her wanted to be closer. The conversation started lightly, neighbors talking about trivial things. She asked about my work, my late-night errands, what I usually did on evenings like this. But beneath the surface of her voice, there was something else, a quietness, a kind of searching. I listened, not just to her words, but to the pauses in between. Those silences carried weight. They felt like spaces where something unsaid wanted to be spoken, where loneliness crept in but didn't dare show itself too boldly. As the minutes stretched, I realized I wasn't just a guest in her home. I was stepping into a space she rarely shared, a side of herself she rarely revealed. And as the lamplight softened around us, the night seemed to grow smaller, pulling me closer to the center of her world. The tea warmed my hands, but it was the silence between us that seemed to glow the most. At first, we traded easy words, small talk about neighbors, the weather, how the building always smelled faintly of fresh paint. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the conversation began to shift. She leaned back against the sofa cushion, her eyes following the steam rising from her cup as though it carried her thoughts upward. "He works late a lot," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Sometimes all night." I didn't respond right away. I wasn't sure if she wanted me to. But when she finally glanced at me, her expression open and searching, I nodded gently. "That must feel lonely." Her lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a small admission of truth. "It does. Some nights feel endless." The honesty in her words hung in the space between us. She wasn't dramatic. She wasn't complaining. She was simply telling me something she hadn't said out loud before, and somehow I knew I was supposed to hear it. I shifted forward slightly, resting my cup on the table. "I know what you mean," I admitted. "There are nights I don't want to go home either. It's not the silence that gets to me. It's realizing no one's there to notice if you are." She looked at me then, really looked. Her eyes softened, a glimmer of recognition passing through them. For a moment, the years between us seemed irrelevant. We were just 2 people sitting in the quiet, both carrying the same kind of emptiness. Her hand toyed with the edge of the blanket draped over the couch, her fingers smoothing the fabric as if it gave her something to do while her thoughts settled. "Sometimes I wonder," she said slowly, "if I've built a life where I'm present for everyone but myself." I wanted to reach for her hand then, to tell her she wasn't invisible, not to me. But I held back, afraid of moving too quickly, afraid of breaking the fragile honesty of the moment. Instead, I let my voice carry the weight of what I felt. "I don't think you're the kind of person who could ever be overlooked." "Not really." Her breath caught, almost imperceptibly, and she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her eyes dropping for just a second before lifting back to mine. There was a faint blush on her cheeks, the kind that comes not from embarrassment, but from being seen, truly seen. The silence that followed was thick, not awkward, but meaningful. A silence filled with everything neither of us dared to say out loud yet. Her gaze lingered on mine a moment longer than it should have, then flickered away, only to return again as though pulled by something stronger than caution. I realized then that this wasn't about tea or conversation or even passing time while her husband was away. This was about a connection she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, and about me, sitting there, drawn deeper into her world with every unspoken truth. The confessions lingered in the room long after they were spoken. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Instead, we sat together in that golden lamplight, the weight of honesty hanging gently between us. She reached for the photo album on the shelf beside the couch, her movements unhurried but purposeful. "I don't usually take this out," she murmured, almost apologetically, as she placed the album on the table. The leather cover was worn, the corners softened by years of handling. I leaned closer, curious. She slid onto the couch beside me, the space between us shrinking to almost nothing. It felt natural, as if the air itself had guided her there. Yet my heart responded with an unsteady rhythm. She opened the album, and the pages came alive with captured moments. Birthdays, vacations, dinners that looked like laughter had once filled the room. She pointed at a picture of herself much younger, standing near a seaside cliff. Her hair blew wildly in the wind, and her smile was radiant. "That was years ago. Feels like another lifetime," she said with a wistful softness. I studied the photo, then glanced at her. "You haven't changed as much as you think." Her laugh was quiet, low, the kind of sound that brushes against your skin and stays there. "You're kind," she said, shaking her head, but I caught the way her eyes warmed, as though my words mattered more than she let on. As she turned the pages, our shoulders brushed. A small, accidental contact at first, or maybe not entirely accidental. I felt the warmth of her arm through the thin fabric of her sleeve, and though neither of us acknowledged it, neither of us moved away. She leaned a little closer to show me another photograph, her hand resting lightly on the page. My own hand hovered nearby, and for a long, charged moment, I debated whether to close that tiny gap. The space between our fingers was no more than an inch, but it felt like the longest distance in the world. Her knee shifted slightly, brushing against mine. Just the faintest contact, but enough to send a current running up my leg, straight into my chest. I stole a glance at her. She was still focused on the album, but there was a subtle tension in the way her lips pressed together, as though she, too, felt the electricity of the closeness. I let my hand drift a little closer, fingers resting against the fabric of the couch, brushing lightly against hers. It was nothing more than a touch, barely there, yet the effect was profound. She stilled, not pulling away, not even pretending she hadn't noticed. The room felt smaller suddenly, the glow of the lamp dimmer, as though the world had narrowed down to this. Her warmth beside me, the quiet weight of her presence, and the silent acknowledgement that something was shifting. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. That first touch, as slight as it was, carried more meaning than words ever could. The photo album lay open on her lap, but neither of us seemed to notice it anymore. The pages had blurred into the background, forgotten in the quiet gravity that had formed between us. Her hand was still resting close to mine, the lightest brush of her fingers against my own. It wasn't a firm touch, nothing deliberate, and yet it carried a weight that pressed against my chest. I felt every detail of that contact. The warmth of her skin, the faint tremor of hesitation, the way her hand didn't retreat. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. The sound filled the silence, and yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It was alive, a silence that hummed with possibility. When I turned my head to look at her, I found her already watching me. Her eyes held mine, steady and unflinching, though her breath caught just slightly betraying what words could not. The age between us, the differences in our lives, all seemed to vanish in that locked gaze. All that remained was the quiet acknowledgement of what was happening, of what neither of us dared to name. She leaned in ever so slightly, not enough to close the distance, but enough for me to feel the warmth of her breath brushing against my cheek. I swallowed, my heart racing, torn between caution and desire. Her lips parted softly, as if she wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, her eyes flickered down for a fleeting second, toward my mouth, before darting back up. The gesture was so brief, so subtle, but it struck me harder than anything she could have said aloud. I found myself leaning too, almost unconsciously, as though drawn by something stronger than reason. My shoulder pressed more firmly against hers, my hand now fully touching hers on the cushion. Our fingers didn't intertwine, not yet, but the contact was no longer accidental. She let out a slow breath, one that shivered in the quiet. The corners of her mouth lifted just slightly, a smile not of amusement, but of recognition, as though we both understood the fragile line we were balancing on. The silence deepened, thickened, until I could hear nothing but her breathing and the frantic rhythm of my own pulse. The lamplight caught in her eyes, turning them into pools of amber that seemed to hold me captive. I wanted to close the distance. I wanted to lean in that last inch. But I didn't. Neither did she. We hovered there, suspended in a moment that felt infinite, a moment that was less about the act itself and more about the anticipation, the exquisite ache of restraint. Her hand shifted slightly, her fingers brushing against mine in a feather-light caress. That tiny gesture said everything her lips hadn't, an invitation, a confession, a quiet admission that she felt it too. The album slid from her lap onto the table with a soft thud, forgotten entirely. And in that dimly lit room, with nothing but silence and a ticking clock to bear witness, I realized we had crossed into a place we could never return from. The world outside might as well not have existed. The hum of traffic, the faint noises of the building, none of it mattered anymore. Everything had narrowed to her beside me, her warmth pressed just close enough to make the air between us electric. Her hand lingered near mine on the cushion, our fingers brushing in tentative, stolen touches. It would have been so easy to pull away, to pretend it was nothing, but neither of us did. Instead, she shifted slightly, her body angling toward me, and I felt the quiet gravity of that decision. She let out a breath, soft and unsteady, before leaning against me. At first, it was the lightest pressure, the side of her arm brushing mine, her shoulder easing against my chest. But then she let her weight rest there fully, her head finding its place against my shoulder. The moment she settled, something inside me softened. My arm moved instinctively around her, slow and hesitant at first, then more certain as I felt her relax into the hold. Her cheek rested against me, her hair brushing against my jaw, and the faint scent of her perfume rose like a memory I already knew I would never forget. We didn't speak. Words would have been too loud, too clumsy for a moment like this. Instead, there was only the rhythm of our breathing, the way hers gradually synced with mine, steady and calm. Each exhale warmed the fabric of my shirt. Each heartbeat seemed to echo louder in my chest. She closed her eyes. I could feel it in the way her body softened against me, as though the act of leaning into me was a surrender she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. It wasn't just closeness, it was trust, an unspoken belief that she was safe here with me. I tightened my hold slightly, enough for her to feel it, but not enough to make it possessive. My thumb brushed against her upper arm, slow and absent-minded, though every stroke carried more feeling than I could have ever put into words. Her breath caught once, a faint hitch, before evening out again. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper, her lips so close I could feel the warmth of the words against my chest. It's been so long since I've felt this steady. I swallowed hard, my throat tight. I wanted to tell her what I was feeling too, that this steadiness she spoke of was exactly what I'd been searching for without realizing it. But the words stayed inside, replaced by the simple act of holding her closer. The minutes stretched into something timeless. The golden lamplight wrapped us in its soft glow, casting the room into a kind of cocoon. It wasn't passion that filled the space, but tenderness, the quiet intimacy of two people who, against reason, have found a piece of themselves in each other. And in that embrace, with her resting against me and my arms steady around her, I knew this night wasn't about temptation. It was about connection, something fragile, something dangerous perhaps, but undeniably real. Time became slippery after that. Minutes folded into hours, yet neither of us seemed to notice. We sat together on that couch, her head resting against my shoulder, my arms steady around her. Sometimes we spoke in low voices, fragments of stories, pieces of ourselves we had never thought to share. Other times, silence carried us, soft and unbroken, like waves lapping gently against the shore. At some point, the lamplight seemed to fade into the pale glow of dawn. I didn't realize how late it had become until I noticed the faint silver edge of daylight seeping through the curtains. The world was beginning again outside, but inside her living room, time still felt suspended. She shifted slightly, her cheek brushing against me as she stirred. Her hand, which had been resting lightly on my arm, gave a small, unconscious squeeze before loosening. When her eyes fluttered open, they were softer than I had ever seen them. Tired, yes, but also at peace. For a moment, she looked at me as though she was trying to memorize the sight, the closeness, the warmth, the proof that she hadn't dreamed this night. Then she sat up slowly, though not pulling far away, and let out a breath that seemed to carry both relief and reluctance. "It's morning already," she whispered, her voice husky from hours of quiet. I nodded, my throat tight. "Yeah, it is." The words felt too simple for everything that had passed between us. I stood, more from instinct than intention, and she rose with me. The soft hush of the morning filled the room, and in that stillness, the thought of leaving pressed heavier on me than I expected. I moved toward the door, but before I could reach it, her hand found mine. Her touch was gentle, deliberate, her fingers wrapping around mine as though to anchor me there a moment longer. "You don't have to rush," she said softly. Her eyes held mine, steady and vulnerable at once. "Not yet." I paused, my breath catching. That one sentence unraveled the quiet restraint we had both carried all night. She wasn't asking for anything reckless, nothing dramatic. She was simply asking me to stay, to linger in the safety of what we had found together, even if only for a little longer. I turned back toward her, her hand still holding mine. The morning light had begun to spill through the curtains now, painting her in soft gold. It touched her hair, glowed against her skin, and in that glow she looked at once ageless and achingly human, a woman who had let me see the quiet, hidden corners of her heart. I stepped closer, and this time I didn't hesitate. I lifted my free hand and brushed a stray lock of hair gently behind her ear. My fingertips lingered for just a second longer than they needed to, and she leaned subtly into the touch, her eyes closing with a quiet exhale. When she opened them again, her gaze was calm, steady, no longer searching, no longer unsure. "Then I'll stay," I whispered. And in that moment, with the soft light of morning settling around us and her hand still warm in mine, I knew this night hadn't been about crossing a line. It had been about finding a truth we both had been missing, a truth that neither of us could ever return from.